I've always asked myself, what do I need to do in order to change the political situation?
Katherine Gehl has been doing quite a bit to change that situation. Voters in as many as 4 states this year may have the chance to pass her Final 5 voting system as a ballot measure in 2024, as Alaska did in the year 2020. But getting to this pivotal point, that's been years in the making.
So if at first I needed to sell my business, yes. Then I needed to fundraise, yes. Then I needed to make an intellectual case for competition lens of politics, the politics industry theory.
That case was first publicly made in a Harvard Business Review article co-authored with renowned strategist Michael Porter. Soon after, developed into a book, The Politics Industry, which energized reform teams in multiple states.
Then I needed to try to sell this reform to people, and then I needed to found a campaign, et cetera. It just went like that.
Final 4 or Final 5 voting, both are the combination of an open, unified primary with a ranked choice voting or instant runoff general election, as occurred in the Alaska election of 2022. It's intended to shift the priorities of our elected representatives away from their next primary campaign and toward a competitive general election based on policies for the many, not performance for the few.
Primary wasn't a verb anymore in Alaska. You can't primary anyone. That attack doesn't exist. It was all gone, and no one even knew it was gone.
A conversation in 3 parts this episode with Katherine Gehl, a former food company CEO. Her Institute for Political Innovation and Action Fund, they operate like a venture capital incubator for electoral entrepreneurs in states red, blue, and purple. In part 1, we discuss the outlook for these 2024 state ballot initiatives.
This year is super exciting. We are poised to have 4 states on the ballot in 2024 November.
Part 2, the years of effort that have led to this 2024 inflection point, with Final 5 voting on the cusp of becoming a national movement.
Over the time that I've been working on this, again, going all the way back to 2013, but really trying to raise money actively since 2015, the reception has changed dramatically.
And part 3, why this innovation is not simply about who gets elected.
Here's why I love Final 5 voting, because it is a political innovation that is designed not to necessarily change who wins elections, but to change what the winners do when they're doing their jobs in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitol.
I'm Robert Pease, and this is The Purple Principle, podcast on the perils of polarization, focusing this season on efforts to depolarize our politics. If you've been listening this season, you've heard Eric Bronner describe the epiphany he had reading Katherine and Michael Porter's book, The Politics Industry.
But the research was so compelling, Rob, and really the solutions they proposed were so compelling to me. I was desperate to get involved and be a part of making things better.
That inspired Eric to co-found Veterans for All Voters, working on election reform efforts nationwide. You've also heard Charlie Sykes discuss the challenges of effectively communicating Final 5 voting reforms in our post-truth ecosystem.
In terms of actually changing the political dynamics, it would make a huge difference. But at the same time, it's not exactly sexy.
Yes.
It's not exactly the kind of thing that is easily explained. And it's the kind of thing that is easily demagogued.
But it's been over 3 years since we've heard directly from Katherine Gehl. So to kick off our series on election reforms, let's turn away from the presidential race, the Trump trials, all the polarizing clickbait for a few important minutes, and focus on these state reforms this 2024 election cycle that could have national ramifications for decades to come.
Oh, since we talked 3 years ago, we have made so much progress, which is to say we've doubled the number of states that have passed through ballot initiative Final 4 or Final 5 election initiatives. We had Alaska as of 2020, and then we had Nevada pass this in 2022. And they passed it by 7 points, which was a greater margin than any of their candidate races. And then, of course, as I believe we'll discuss, we are on track to be on the ballot in 4 states with Final Four elections or Final Five elections this fall, November. And the citizens of all those states will get to decide if this is how they would like to hire the people who represent them.
What are your initial reactions to Nevada being state number 2? Alaska has kind of a unique political culture. Were you concerned at all? What are your first impressions of Nevada as a candidate for Final Four voting?
So my first impressions of Nevada as a candidate for Final Five elections were yes. And that might sound sort of naive, but here's what I'll say. We, at that point, the small number of people really wanted to, see this move forward. We didn't have the ability to take a spreadsheet and put all the states on it and look at all these different factors and have, 20 good opportunities and then get to pick whatever we wanted. And you had a state where the people in the state wanted to bring this to their state. And our job was to say, yes, we support you. I put my vote or my investment, I cheer on, I help, I support states where there is leadership in the state that wants to make it happen. That's who I count on.
Is Idaho the next state that initiates a serious signature gathering effort?
So I actually thought that Arizona was going to be the next state likely to have a Final Five election ballot initiative in 24 because they had a super motivated group of leaders and they contacted me very early and they were very politically sophisticated. So I was very bullish there. I spent lots of time there. And then ultimately, it's like I say, there's a funnel and then you drop off when it becomes clear that it's not a good investment. I mean, you need to make a rational decision. So they're moving forward with a different type of reform right now, which I will certainly be rooting for. Idaho got their signature gathering started next because, as I mentioned, they are doing this all volunteer. So we knew pretty early on that they were going to go to the ballot. They have a good track record, the people working on it there, for signature. So we knew early on. And then we were also looking at New York City for 24, which ultimately is moved. We were looking at Massachusetts for 24, which is moved to 26. So there's just lots of things we're looking at. And ultimately it comes down to 4 still in the pipeline for 24. And we simply won't know until the deadlines are final in these states, what's on the ballot. And even after that, you won't really know where you're competing because if you don't have a path to victory, you won't continue investing dollars there. And then we've got 2 states left in the pipeline that still may go, and I hope they go, and that is Montana and Colorado. And Colorado is going to be the last to know. I think it's totally appropriate that the people running these campaigns look with a critical eye at every new stage as kind of a go, no-go decision. And if they continue to have a path to victory, they should go. Even if it's risky, even if it's not 100%, but if they get to the point where they 100% don't have a path to victory, then you shouldn't, there's no need to be a martyr for these causes, and it would certainly hurt us to lose too many places.
Well, let's turn then to the effort in Idaho, led by Jim Jones, former Attorney General and State Supreme Court Chief Justice.
I guess you might say I'm a political activist. I've got organizations that I work with to try to moderate the Republican Party, to pass ballot initiatives that the legislature refuses to deal with.
How critical is it to have someone with that level of experience and stature like Jim Jones involved in this Idaho effort?
I can't overemphasize how critical it is that Jim Jones is the face of this campaign and has dedicated so much of his personal time and reputation and network to making this happen. There's no substitute for successful, respected leaders in the state who are associated with the party in that state, if it's a red or blue state, to be making the case to the voters there that this is a good thing. That can't come from outside the state resources. It can't come from people who have not been successful in their current system. It needs to come from people who have already delivered value for that state, like Jim Jones has, and who says, and this is a better way forward. He's critical.
Another important leader in Idaho is Luke Mayville. He's co-founder of the grassroots movement Reclaim Idaho.
Many of us for years have been working on one bad policy at a time, trying to fix it, one injustice at a time, trying to address it.
How would you describe Luke and Reclaim Idaho and their track record of organizing and passing Medicaid expansion, among other initiatives?
Luke Mayville is another Idaho treasure, an enormously talented guy who could be having quite the career in academics, who decided to return to his home state in order to work on this kind of political systemic change, both on issues and then the structural Final Four elections that he's doing now. He is tireless. He is brilliant. You just have to read his academic work, a book he wrote on John Adams, to know about his brilliance. And the combination of someone like Luke with Jim Jones is a bit of the dream that you can put that together. What I will say excited me initially when I became familiar with what the Idaho effort was the fact that Luke Mayville, who was one of the founders of Reclaim Idaho, had this incredible track record of delivering on ballot initiatives or delivering on the pressure that can be created by the possibility of a ballot initiative to make policy change in your state. The idea that he planned with his collaborators, he works in a totally bipartisan fashion, he's an independent, that they planned to collect all these signatures using volunteers, it couldn't be more exciting than that, because in so many states, the collection of signatures for the ballot initiative has just turned into how much money does it take to hire these people who barely know what they're working for to stand outside the supermarket to get signatures? Whereas this was a true grassroots effort in Idaho, which is the complete spirit of the ballot initiative.
So we were talking about the bottom-up effort in Idaho. In Colorado, you have someone of incredible stature and resources in Kent Thiry. It seems on the face of it, more of a top-down effort, and there's some possibility, we haven't even interviewed Kent Thiry, but there are articles mentioning that he's also interested in running for governor at some point. If that is the case, does it complicate the effort?
One of the things we've been repeatedly discussing in this conversation is the question as to whether a certain factor in a state is going to complicate this. Does this make it harder? Does this make it easier? Every state is going to have a set of circumstances that line up to deliver headwinds or tailwinds to the effort. And there's no state where there aren't going to be, headwinds that are pushing against adoption. So if in Colorado people say, oh, because Kent Thiry's involved and he's been rumored to be a gubernatorial candidate, maybe, that's bad. That can be totally, in my view, mitigated by the pros of the fact that you have someone of Kent Thiry's stature and engagement in the political realm and experience in passing ballot initiatives. So it nets out that it's a pro. And everybody who's looking for a reason why, this is not perfect, that's just how life works.
Well, we have talked to people at some of these state-level efforts who want to get to Final Five voting, and they just don't think they can do it in one ballot measure.
I could be wrong, for sure, that going in steps is not advisable, which is what I think. But people who know their states are the ones who definitely should make that decision. It is their state. But I would recommend collectively as a movement that we focus on states where it wouldn't be iterative, where we go for it right now. I think if we got Final Five, the whole enchilada in other states, and then they saw the results, that maybe you could return to those states in a few years and it would be a different story about whether they could get that done in the more gold standard way. Here's how I put it. Some time ago, actually, it was when I still did like ranked choice voting on its own, before I realized it was not sufficient. And I was involved in helping Maine pass that. And I was talking to some other reformers who didn't want to be involved in Maine or put any money there because it looked like it was going to be really hard to win. And I said to the guy at that time, you know, I want to leave his name out of it. I'll just call him Sam. Sam, why? Like, the only thing you seem to be willing to do is to play games that you know you can win. You need to play games worth losing. I think the games you're playing, even if you win them, they won't change anything. So how about you play a game that, yeah, you might lose. It's not for sure you'll win. But if you were to win it, it would change results for real people in our democracy. That's a game worth losing, and therefore I also think it's the only game worth winning and the only game worth playing. And that is it's just a different perspective.
We're speaking with Katherine Gehl, co-author of The Politics Industry and founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. Over the 3 years since we last had Katherine on the show, she and her team have moved from proving the concept of Final Five voting to advising and fundraising for multiple state-level election reforms. That includes the state of Idaho, where we spoke with the reform leader and former GOP Attorney General Jim Jones about the challenges he faces there, including from the current Attorney General.
Well, early on, before we had the ballot, the language for the ballot measure, the Attorney General did a review, and it was very unhelpful. And that's something that would go on the ballot in November when people are deciding what they want to do. So we had to file a suit. It set us back a couple of months. We got the Idaho Supreme Court to agree to make the Attorney General change the language that people will see.
That was just one of several roadblocks erected by the current government against the ballot initiative.
And of course, there's been several bills introduced in the legislature to try to impede our effort, but none of them were able to get through the legislative process. So it's been a tough drive.
Luke Mayville of Reclaim Idaho, he's led that drive, resulting in over 90,000 signatures submitted in a state of less than 900,000 registered voters.
You know, you go out to communities and host public events, and what you find is, you know, an opposition forms that isn't really willing to have the real debate about, you know, the pros and cons, the trade-offs.
Part of that challenge has been combating the misinformation spun around these reforms, including that they're too complex for voters, or that they're secretly partisan in nature.
Oftentimes, it just turns into a nonstop battle, a nonstop information battle, just clearing away the misinformation and getting out the truth. But I suppose that's politics.
We'll learn more about the politics of that Idaho effort in our next episode. But let's not lose track of the fact that Idaho is one of 4 states that could pass Katherine Gehl's Final Five electoral reforms this year. That in turn could liberate 8 U.S. senators and a few dozen U.S. House members from party-run primary battles, potentially break political gridlock on immigration, gun violence, the deficit, climate change, and other chronic issues. We wondered then, about the very early days of Katherine's efforts, such as her first attempts to raise some serious money for serious electoral reform. Was she successful right out of the gate a decade ago in presenting her nonpartisan, common-sense solutions to polarization and gridlock? Well, it turns out, not really.
So composite meeting, I'm in New York, I'm talking to a billionaire CEO, businessman. I mean, they were basically men. And we have a long conversation that is going so well because what, at least in my view, what I'm saying is really resonating with this person and they kind of love it. And my 15-minute meeting is now an hour and a half. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I really need to ask this person for $5 million, not $1 million as I was planning, because this is going gangbusters. But before I can get the ask out of my mouth, the person says to me, Katherine, this is awesome. Count me in for $25K. And I was like, wow, that is not the scale of anything that's going to solve this problem. And I definitely didn't sell the person on how this would make a difference. And I decided, you know what? I need to write a prospectus, a thesis for investment to describe the ROI, the return on investment of making changes in the political system that make sense to these investors because they just didn't see it. They thought it was a good cause, but not a rational cause. And that's when I went back to Michael Porter from Harvard Business School and said, hey, I want to write this ROI using the 5 forces, and I'd like you to co-author it with me because I am not famous for the 5 forces. In fact, I'm not famous at all, and it will really be of help if you could come on board. And at the time, I thought that would be enough of a contribution. So I used to hand out at Harvard Business School, let's say we would make a presentation to 700 people at an alumni event. And then I had people at the back of the room holding little, photocopied sheets of, if you're interested, contact this organization for this thing and this organization for that. And here's the grade I would give myself for action resulting from their interest, F. There was too much friction, right? They didn't call these people or get involved. So then I realized, I need to get, these reform organizations to take on what at that point was Final Four elections as a priority. And then they didn't do that. They weren't interested because they already had a suite of reforms that they and their donors were invested in. So that was why I had to found an organization, because even though maybe they would have done a little of it, they weren't going to prioritize it and sell it as fundamentally different than any of these other efforts. And yet there I was, and I said, it's white space. I have to do it because we have to be Final 5 elections or nothing. And so I did. And it was always, for me, meant to be a catalyst organization, which is to say I didn't found this nonprofit so it could go on and on for decades and we would work on this issue and then the next issue and the next issue. I founded this to catalyze demand for Final 5 elections. And that's why, for example, I'm so excited that in this year of 2024, the demand has been created. We are hopefully on the ballot in 4 more states this year. There are multiple states that have campaigns for 26, plus New York City, plus our legislative campaigns like in Wisconsin. It's there, and that's what we meant to do.
So you had mentioned going back 7 years or so when you first went to New York, you were trying to raise money. You thought people were on board, people with a lot of resources who would spend potentially millions on, races, only interested in about thousands for your effort. Has that changed? Have you been able to go back to some of those people and say, Alaska, Nevada, 4 states, looking at it this year, are you ready to support us?
Over the time that I've been working on this, again, going all the way back to 2013, but really trying to raise money actively since 2015, the reception has changed dramatically. And that is gratifying. So people that initially didn't want to invest because they didn't think it was achievable, well, they can now see that we're 2 for 2, Alaska, Nevada. People who didn't want to invest initially because they didn't really understand, what this could do, have now had all the experience of these 7 years to become so much more familiar with the problems that were hidden from them 7 years ago. And so they've now had this whole experience, and things have arguably gotten much worse. The public has gotten much more dissatisfied. And so that's changed their reception to Final Five voting because, well, let me say it another way. Now people know it's achievable because we're 2 for 2. Now they understand the drivers of the dysfunction more from personal experience, and the way that the media has been covering politics has really unconcealed the problem of party primaries and the problem of so little competition. And then they also now, given that they understand the problem better, can see how Final Five elections would change those incentives. So they understand the solution better, they understand the problem more, and they believe we can make it happen. Put those things together, and yes, absolutely easier to raise money. It's not super easy. It's not as easy as I wish it were and think it should be, but that's just the task. That is the task in front of us, is to earn that investment with the arguments that we make.
Katherine Gehl of the Institute for Political Innovation is our featured guest this episode, kicking off our election reform series. She and her team are 2 for 2 in having passed Final Four voting in Alaska in 2020 and the first of 2 steps for Final Four in Nevada in 2022. Can they possibly go 4 for 5 or 6 in the 2024 election cycle? Again, that could break congressional gridlock on a number of major issues in Washington, as well as state capitals. Don't take my word on that. Let's hear from 2 pragmatic U.S. House members on the challenges of getting important things done in Congress. On the Republican side, former 3-term Texas House member Will Hurd, who represented the largest border district in the country.
But things don't get done because both sides would rather use some of these issues as a political bludgeon against each other rather than ultimately solve the problem. And that is a problem with how our elections are devised. When 92% of seats are decided in a primary, those elected officials are only talking to that primary voter.
Well, on the Democratic side, but very much from the center.
And I'm a member of the Western Caucus, which right now is 106 Republicans and me.
Alaska's at-large representative, Mary Peltola, one of only 2 U.S. Congress members elected through a final 4 or 5 voting ballot so far.
Systemically, I think getting away from these closed party primaries, because then every Republican is trying to out-Republican each other, every Democrat is trying to out-Democrat each other, and then you are left with 2 extremes. I think that we have record low voter turnout for a reason, because people don't want to listen to this kind of bickering.
Final Five voting neutralizes polarizing primaries with a unified open primary, followed by a ranked choice or instant runoff general election. But to push Final Five voting over the finish line, Katherine Gehl and the leaders in each of these states, they need to build broad cross-partisan coalitions, never an easy thing, but perhaps especially difficult, presidential election cycles. That's why Katherine emphasizes not who gets elected through Final Five, but how those elected choose to govern.
Here's why I love Final Five voting, because it is a political innovation that is designed not to necessarily change who wins elections, but to change what the winners do when they're doing their jobs in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitol, which is to say, is their primary focus and motivation, or at least is it a very high priority for them, to work on solving real problems for real people in a sustainable way? Or, as now, is their purpose to have a performative politics? Okay? So that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. And Final Five answers that challenge by creating an election system that changes the incentives for the action while people are doing their jobs. So think of it this way. Right now, in 85 or 90% of cases, the US House members are elected in the summer in party primaries where only a tiny proportion of voters turn out. That's who hires them. And those, therefore, are the hiring managers. And these hiring managers on the right and these hiring managers on the left are about 8% of the public, electing about 90% of the legislature. And you think they can't be more different, right? Because they're from the right and the left, but they're actually virtually identical in one particularly wildly consequential way, which is to say that these two sides are motivated by negative partisanship. That means they're motivated more by their animosity to the one other side than they are by their adherence to a certain party platform and policy issues. When these are the people that hire and these are the people that fire, that's who those elected have to listen to. What Final Five voting does is make sure that no one gets hired until November voters turn out, and that no one gets hired without a majority of November voters, and that no one gets hired without real competition to be hired. And it also changes what the winners do, because when you're hired by a majority of November voters, you have a great deal of agency. Things that would get you fired if you're hired in a summer by 8% of people, which is to say negotiating, finding a consensus way forward, voting yes on a deal for immigration or for debt deficit reduction where nobody gets everything they want, those things would make you lose in the current hiring system, but they are paths to victory when you're hired by November voters. And that's the way to change the system, is just to change who hires and to make sure there's competition for those jobs.
Well, it's very early in the amount of data or anecdotal evidence from Alaska, but they have had most of a legislative session, having been elected under Final Four and facing re-election under Final Four. What have you heard from people in Alaska about the incentives within the legislature so far?
The news from the people in Alaska's legislature whom I talk to is really good, which is that they say that this election system, Final Four elections, has changed what they do in their jobs and has changed what their colleagues do. At the beginning of their session, when they formed this bipartisan majority coalition, they were able to agree on 3 top priorities, and they've been successful at moving those through the legislature. They have bipartisan leadership. You know, they share the leadership control. They certainly had the exact opposite experience of what the U.S. House had when they were choosing leadership of their chamber.
So there is a repeal effort in Alaska. It's an unpredictable state. If it is, for some reason, successful, the repeal, but other states, Nevada, Idaho, other states, have success this year, on balance, how do you come out in that scenario? How does the reform movement stand if that first, relatively inspiring case is repealed?
Any setback is a setback. Having said that, if it were to be repealed in Alaska, if the repeal was successful, but we still won in other states, then the experiment of Final Four and Final Five voting lives on, and is ultimately the results of the experiment in governing that is going to determine whether we expand or not. So as long as there are states active in the experiment, we'll be able to keep going, even if Alaska would be repealed. It would be sad and devastating and not helpful for Alaskans. I wouldn't be surprised if they came back again and changed it. That's the way change happens sometimes in democracies. And I haven't found a better way to hire in America under the rules that we already have in our Constitution than this construct of open single ballot primaries plus top 4 or top 5 general election. So I think we'll go this way because we won't, as Americans, be satisfied with the kind of results we're getting now. And if it gets proven in small ways in just a couple states, people do not look at something better. As hard as change is, people don't look at something better and say, yeah, I get it, but no thanks. I'm going to stick with what I have. That's not the kind of response our current system gets, that, yeah, I think we'll just stay with this, because there's so much dissatisfaction. So right now we have to really push. If these states start to get great results, then we'll see the benefits of competition, because states are always in competition with each other, right? They're competing for investment, they're competing for jobs, they're competing for tourism, they're competing for their own advancement and economic prosperity, et cetera, as a state. And once it becomes clear that this competitive advantage being governed this way, then other states will want to do it. There will be a pull, not a push.
Could 2024 be the year Final Five voting is pulled by voters onto the national stage, with as many as 4 states passing ballots this election cycle, more coming online for 2026? Will that in turn add to momentum for legislative reform efforts in states like Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania? Stay tuned here as we meet the grassroots leaders in each of these 2024 state efforts and circle back with Katherine Gehl and other changemakers on the prospects for Final Five voting and other election reforms. In our next episode, we'll travel to Idaho to meet with Jim Jones, former GOP Attorney General and conservative state Supreme Court Chief Justice, who believes the open primaries plus Final Four voting effort could dramatically improve the quality of Idaho governance.
You know, I think back to what caused there to be a faction problem in the Republican Party, and it probably dates back to the fight over the closing of the primary. And, of course, it's gotten to the point that we now have a Republican Civil War. And the people who are traditional Republicans are supporting the initiative.
We hope you'll join us for this extended series running through the November election. Share us on social media and check out our YouTube page for video highlights of our interview with Katherine Gehl and other featured guests. Purple Principle is created by a talented team of audio reformers. Kevin A. Klein, Senior Audio Engineer, Alex Carreau, Associate Producer, Trevor Prophet, Digital Ops and Strategy, Mary Claire Cogler, Video Production, and Sarah Kim, Fact Checking and Research. Purple Principle is a Fluent Knowledge production. Original music by Ryan Adair Rooney.